You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was a special conversation with my friend, Reverend Dr. David Moore, at our Dinner and Dialogue gathering on April 9th, 2025. In this episode, we talk about non-duality as it relates to race and justice work in our time. Thanks for tuning in. So many of you know that we've been in a series of conversations on non-duality called Holding It Together. I think many of us feel in this time like we're just holding it together on some level. And yet there's also this deeper invitation in that idea of practicing, putting on the lens of seeing the world as inherently interconnected. Another way to say non-duality is essentially no separation. And so we've been having these conversations each week and kind of looking at these various aspects of non-duality from, the dualism of the sacred and the secular to kind of what it looks like to practice non-duality in our contemplative lives, from prayer to just experience of turning to wonder when we kind of run into dead ends in our own thinking. But I also wanted to just have a conversation about non-duality and justice, because I think at a surface level, oftentimes, non-duality can seem like it blesses both the bad and the good, right? Because if there's really this underlying interconnectedness, there is, everything sort of where everything belongs, there is a tendency, I think, sometimes toward needing to figure out, what it looks like to be both non-dual and just at the same time. So I want to invite my friend David Moore to come up and join me for a little conversation. Can we welcome David really quick? Let me give you this one here.
All right.
Does that one work for you?
Works for me.
I just hope this thing holds me up. But yeah, I was interested in kind of dialoguing about this topic with David, who's a local, colleague of mine, but also a dear friend with whom I share a contemplative kinship, but also a kinship in, fostering community for love and liberation here in Santa Barbara. So, David, what do you think about all this? I mean, we talked a little bit earlier today, just kind of getting ready for tonight's conversation, but I think your first observation about the way that you and your community practice non-duality was a wonderful invitation, I think, to a discussion here. So, yeah.
Yeah. Hello, beautiful people. I don't know if I think that we're on a journey towards practicing it. So we're actually practicing it to practice it. When I was talking with Tim earlier, I was saying that there's a phenomenology that happens in people's experiences collectively. And it's a component of our spiritual awareness and our existence. I think everybody's pretty much, I wouldn't be surprised if everybody here knows that meditation helps to dissolve our ties to ego dominance. And so that's why meditation is really important, to enter into access to the experience of non-duality. But one thing that may be, well, not maybe, but I think is certainly overlooked and bypassed is, in a sense, what we're doing here tonight, and that is not just isolation in meditation, but in collective encounter together. And so when we talked earlier, I mentioned, from a Black church experience, something that is not easy to import into any other context is how preaching is a communal experience. I remember one time I spoke at an event, and it was, there were a lot of black folks there. So I brought out my black preach, And then that was in another city, and there was a woman from here who happened to be there. And I was speaking at another event here, and she said, I hope you do it like you did at the other event. And I was like, you just can't do that. I mean, it's everybody. It just doesn't work that way. And so I remember when I was my first time traveling to Africa, I was actually in Ghana. Diane and I, we had such an amazing collective experience in church, and I tried to bring it home. It just fell flat because, you had to be there. And so I just want to encourage, finding the place of access to, at least practicing to practice.
Yeah. I think, too, one of the things I heard you mention earlier had to do with kind of the phenomenon also of preaching, in the sense of that preaching sort of operates in a different register than the dualisms of our world. It kind of cuts through with a different message. And how would you say that the work of preaching, and speaking a word of non-duality or a word of encouragement of unity cuts through the ways our society uses words?
Yeah, I think that when you are experiencing it with people, it's part of it is because you came to experience it with people. It's not a surprise. It's not like, oh, I think I'm going to get with this. No, it's like we came to do this. We came to engage, a word of justice, a prophetic word. We came to do that, and it's common in the Black church experience, which I don't get enough of, like I did years ago. But it's common to after it was over, man, he really preached. She really brought it today. And it wasn't the individual, it was everybody making that happen because they came to make that happen. No surprises.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me, I was at a conference a number of years ago that was primarily led by BIPOC folks for BIPOC folks, but they let a few Anglo allies come who were on their own decolonizing journeys. And the opening session was a speaker named Therese Taylor Stinson. And one of the things that she said to me that I kind of have never forgotten, and really was my takeaway from the whole experience over there, was that contemplation is not just quiet, still, and silent, but that contemplation is dancing and singing and amening and kind of that collective experience of movement at the same time. Yeah. And so I think, in a lot of kind of centrally white communities, there's a tendency toward the sort of inner stillness modality of contemplation, but there's this whole other side of it that's about the dance. And how have you experienced that in your own experience, like in the Black church, but also as a pastor and a leader? How has contemplation kind of come home for you to be much more than just the meditative moment?
Some of it comes through travel. There's a phenomenon that happens in Africa, in Middle East, and in much of Asia, that when people come together, and this is not restricted to any particular faith tradition, I've just seen it more in church because I've seen more church. But ululating, are you familiar with that? Yeah?
Why
Okay,
don't you
so
define it for us, and we'll tell you if we're familiar with it.
okay, so you might be in a township of, Cape Town, like Khayelitsha, or in Soweto around Johannesburg, and in church, and there may or may not be any musical instruments, but it's a musical experience. And then it's usually what some women do, and I can't replicate it very well, but you've heard it before. It's something like,
Yep.
it happens in a lot of indigenous traditions. I remember the first time I heard that, I stopped. Whatever I was doing in the moment, I stopped, and I just took it in. But it's something that's very visceral, clearly visceral in the way that maybe a whirling dervish experience would be. It's something that goes beyond analysis, and we are often prisoners of analysis and judgment. And we know that to be non-dual is to be non-judging.
I've heard someone say that before, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So in that kind of image of whirling and movement, and I know that you, because you and I have talked about it, but also I follow you on Instagram, and I've seen that part of your practice seems to be moving in the outdoors. How does movement kind of play? And I think there's also, on akin to that is musicality as well. Mm-hmm. How for you do you see that kind of being enfleshed in your life? How do you embody that kind of contemplative movement?
Well, first of all, a lot of it for me is personal and private
Mm-hmm.
in practice.
Mm-hmm.
But when I say that, and I've already said this tonight, I don't have enough of it at a collective level, and I think that there are people. It's the character of our church, but it has become the character of our church over time because the folks, the folks in our community have not experienced it in the way. What I grew up with. There are things that my wife and we grew up with, and just they were presumptive, and we try to connect. I'm not the only one here that does this, but I'm a tree hugger. A literal tree hugger. We were just talking. There was an owl in our house about a month ago.
I saw pictures.
You saw pictures.
Yeah.
I kind of felt like that was a commendation from the universe about some things that my wife and I are contemplating. And who gets an owl? It flew right by me, and it startled me at first. When I woke up that morning and came downstairs, and this huge wingspan just went right by me, and then it perched there, and I took a picture, and I kind of felt like something was going on. Yeah, I still feel that.
Yeah. That's beautiful. So, part of, I think, what you're opening up for us tonight is that there are modes of being beyond rationality and analysis, and you sort of associated that with judgment. And I think one of the reasons we've been in this series of conversations is because we're all living through a time of fragmentation, where we're sort of forced into societal dualisms of us versus them, Democrat versus Republican, progressive versus traditionalist, those kinds of things. And our heart is to, as human beings who live in this society, in this world, to embody a different way of being that can transcend the judgmentalism that contributes to the fragmentation that we see. So I'm curious for you, because you've been in this work in Santa Barbara for a long time of kind of leading movements for justice, and you mentioned the demonstration that's happening this weekend as well. Like, how do you hold to a perspective, as a person, but also as a pastor, of kind of upholding the interconnectedness that we all have, and yet kind of move on behalf of those who are being oppressed and marginalized in a way that doesn't further kind of fragment us? What does that look like? And how would you maybe encourage us to continue in that work?
I think the passageway to our oneness is through the minoritized, through the disenfranchised. And we talked about this in 1 Corinthians, where it says here in the first chapter, so where does this leave the philosophers, the scholars, and the world's brilliant debaters? God has made the wisdom of the world look foolish. Since God in his wisdom, or their wisdom, or her wisdom, saw to it that the world would never know her through human wisdom, she has used our foolish preaching to save those who believe. It is foolish to the Jews who ask for signs from heaven, and to the Greeks who seek human wisdom. And then there's this part where it just, it gives groups, marginalized groups, dishonored groups, and just saying that these are the people who hear this message. They're the ones who, they're the ones who are, uses the word, the language here is that not many of other folks are called. It doesn't mean that the accessibility isn't there. It just means that it's more ready for these people who have been pushed aside. So in order for us to enter into this sense of solidarity, the passageway is through the experience of the people who are otherwise hopeless and people who are poor. That's how we get there. We cannot experience this non-duality by from a top-down perspective. It's something that we experience because we stand with the people in wheelchairs and people going through treatments for transition. We stand with people who are unhoused, not as an aside, not as a diversion, but as a very central practice of our lives. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I hear in that too that there's sort of a metaphysical reality, which is that we all are actually one. We all do come from the same stuff, stardust essentially.
We just don't notice it.
We just don't notice it. And so what I think you're opening up there is that there is a sense in which the light bulb can go off when we see that even in those folks who, like you said, are marginalized and they become central, that it's sort of like a veil is pulled back of that underlying unity. And I'm just curious, as we kind of continue this conversation about non-duality and, your experience here in Santa Barbara, we've shared some of these conversations ourselves, but I'm curious what you see happening in real time in our area, just like how we can, be allies to those who are continuing to be oppressed, and if you'd be open to speaking a little bit about what you're seeing right now in Santa Barbara.
Anecdotally, but this is not a one-off. There was a People's March 2 months ago, I think, downtown, and a woman who's part of our community Her name is Andrea, and she has a little girl who is not yet 3. Her name is Cosma. She's brilliant. She's a prodigy. And says the darndest things. Anyway, Andrea was invited to be a speaker at that event. And so she was holding Cosma, and she walked up to the mic, and just before she got to the mic, someone whispered to her, "Don't say anything about Gaza." And it just set her back. She was like, well, I didn't know someone was going to tell me what I could talk about.
Yeah, couldn't say, right.
And she got up there and she talked for a couple of minutes. And she said nothing about Gaza. But before she left the mic, her little girl said, "Viva, viva Palestina!" That's just one example. I think that there is severe Zionist oppression in our community, reflective of what's happening in our country. I'm not quick to try to evaluate and just say things loosely, but there was an attempt to buy me and my influence financially, and it never occurred to me. I mean, I didn't even know it was happening because I just don't think that way until after the fact, and I thought, wow, that was pretty brazen and disrespectful. But the thing is that these are the people that we have access to our non-duality with. It's the people who are suffering the most. So we can't be won by dismissing people who are paying a price for existing.
Yeah. I mean, it's real. What a time we're living through, Well, as we kind of come to a close here, I think we were trying to uplift this idea of non-duality and trying to make it practical, as practical as possible. So is there anything that you'd encourage our community in as we are attempting to walk this contemplative path, but also this pragmatic path of living a life of interconnectedness? Is there any call to solidarity or to action that you'd want to uplift to us as co-conspirators here in Santa Barbara, here at Way Collective?
Wow, I think you do that. So I'm just kind of like standing alongside you, reinforcing you as you put the call out there to do that. And I think that's something we can all do. We can all stand with people who need to be noticed, who need to be heard. We can uplift people's voices. We can honor people's tears. We can listen.
May it be so.
May it be so.
Wonderful. Can we thank David for being here for this conversation today? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.